I was at a local town hall meeting recently, standing near the back, when a man approached the microphone. He was incredibly charismatic, practically glowing with conviction as he spoke about the country's origins. He held up a pocket constitution like a prop, his voice trembling with emotion as he insisted that we needed to return to our roots as a Christian nation. To him, faith and patriotism were the exact same thing. He spoke about the Founding Fathers with a kind of reverence usually reserved for saints, describing a golden age where the Bible and the law were indistinguishable. But then the atmosphere shifted. Another attendee, a young history teacher, stepped up and calmly read a single sentence from the Treaty of Tripoli, signed by President John Adams in 1797. The government of the United States of America is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion. The reaction from the first man was fascinating to watch. The warmth and reverence instantly evaporated, replaced by a sharp, defensive hostility. He didn't engage with the text or the history. He didn't offer a counter-argument. Instead, he dismissed the document entirely, calling it a technicality and attacking the teacher's patriotism. It was a jarring contradiction. He claimed to revere the founders, yet the moment their actual words contradicted his narrative, he rejected them. That moment of cognitive dissonance, where the desire for political power clashed with the historical reality, perfectly illustrates the tension we face today. It suggests that the push for a Christian nation isn't actually about preserving faith, but about something else entirely. It forces us to ask, if the founders actually designed a wall between church and state, not to silence religion, but to save it, what are we really risking by trying to tear it down? Okay, let's unpack this. That moment, that clash between a political desire and just, verifiable historical truth, it really illustrates the core mechanism we're exploring today.
It really does.
We're left with this question of what happens when faith stops being this source of moral comfort and instead becomes the primary axis for a political struggle. It becomes a kind of weaponized identity.
Precisely. And that's what we're analyzing. The mechanism by which that religious identity is strategically converted into political currency.
Right.
And we're going to look at it across some very diverse contexts.
Right.
So this deep dive will start by establishing the specific ideological foundations of Christian nationalism right here in the U.S. And we'll pay really close attention to the sociological symptoms. The erosion of trust, the rejection of facts that seems to go along with it.
And we're going to zoom out.
Exactly. We'll take a comparative look at constitutional systems globally. We'll see everything from the strict secularism of France to the managed ambiguity of Israel, all of them trying to draw some kind of sustainable line between church and state.
And finally, we'll move beyond the theory to, a really profound and heartbreaking historical case study from Punjab in India. This is a place where that fusion of religion and identity, it was calculated, and it led directly to just widespread human destruction.
It did.
So our mission here is to understand the forces that really benefit when that constitutional or social wall is torn down. And, what is truly sacrificed when leaders decide to pursue political expediency by weaponizing religious identity. Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's start with the U.S. context. The gentleman in the opening story, he was speaking from a place of conviction that, you hear it echoed pretty frequently today.
All the time.
So we need a clear definition. What is Christian nationalism, and how does it show up as a comprehensive political movement, not just, a personal belief?
Right. Fundamentally, Christian nationalism, or CNUS, is defined as the belief that the secular government should actively favor Christianity.
Favor it, or in some cases be replaced by it.
Or, in its more radical forms, be wholly replaced by it.
Yes.
It's this exclusive idea that America belongs to and really exists for the benefit of Christians. It's not about encouraging people to pray.
No.
It's about demanding that the state actively privileges one religious group over all others, often with the explicit goal of shaping law and policy.
And based on the sources this belief system is,
Yeah.
it's so much more than just a desire for, say, prayer in schools. It seems to be deeply integrated with some very specific cultural and social views.
It is. The ideology is inherently intertwined with a specific cultural political identity. And that identity explicitly includes elements of patriarchy, white supremacy, nativism, and heteronormativity.
So it's an exclusive identity by design.
By design.
Yeah.
It seeks to celebrate and privilege what its proponents call the sacred history, liberty, and rightful rule of white conservatives. So you see, it's not just about religious morality, it's about a totalizing social and political order.
And that framing, it seems to be driven by a kind of fear, right?
Yeah. An existential fear. The ideology prioritizes an ethnocultural, ethno-religious, and ethno-nationalist framing. And what drives it is this fear of the other, whether that other is an immigrant, a racial minority, or a sexual minority.
And there's data to back this up.
Oh, absolutely. The sociological data is clear. Christian nationalism is strongly associated with specific negative attitudes like xenophobia, homophobia, and even active opposition to interracial unions.
So it's used as a justification.
Exactly. It's a justification for restricting the civil rights of anyone who failed to conform to these traditional ideals of whiteness, citizenship, and Protestantism. It provides a convenient, total explanation for why those who adhere to the ideology should be the ones to rule.
To really grasp the magnitude of this challenge, we need to understand the scale. I mean, we're not just talking about a few committed activists here. This is a pretty broad segment of the population subscribing to these ideas.
A very broad segment. When researchers measured adherence back in 2017, they estimated that 52% of Americans subscribed to Christian nationalist ideas to some degree.
52%.
52. And they broke this down into two critical groups. The first, about 32%, were accommodators. These are people who, may not be deeply ideological, but they agree with the key policies and cultural premises.
Okay.
But the second group, the fully committed ambassadors, made up an estimated 20%.
1 in 5 Americans.
1 in 5 Americans fully endorsing the idea that America should be legally defined as a Christian nation.
And those numbers, they seem to be consolidating pretty powerfully around specific political alignments in more recent years.
It has. More recent data from 2023 looked at specific political allegiances. Overall, they found 10% of Americans identified as clear adherents and 20% as sympathizers.
Okay, so that's 30% total.
Right. But here's the key part. Those figures spiked dramatically among supporters of Donald Trump. 21% identified as adherents and 34% as sympathizers. So this shows a strong, almost inseparable fusion between this specific ideological framing, this desire for a Christian ethno-state, and a major political movement. The identity has, it's become the currency.
Let's pivot a little bit and analyze this not just as an ideology, but as a kind of a sociological symptom, like a symptom of institutional decay. This idea that as the functional role of traditional Christianity as a social glue erodes, CNUS rushes in to fill that vacuum.
That is the key analytical insight.
It presents this hardened, reactive political identity.
Exactly. When secular structures like universities, the media, government agencies, when they are perceived to be failing or maybe even actively betraying traditional cultural values, people look for an external, totalizing explanation. They want a rigid structure to restore meaning.
And that quest for order, it manifests as distrust.
A deep distrust of existing non-religious institutions. And we see this expressed so profoundly in the relationship with science and expertise. CNUS is strongly associated with a high level of distrust of science, particularly fields that are perceived as challenging biblical authority or, traditional morality.
This link between Christian nationalism and a rejection of institutional science it was impossible to miss during the COVID-19 pandemic. How did the ideology specifically dictate behavior during that crisis?
It became an ideological mandate. It wasn't just individual skepticism anymore. Christian nationalists frequently opposed public health measures. They resisted lockdowns. They resisted restrictions on social gatherings, mask mandates.
The ideology was dictating a specific policy response.
It was, even in the face of widespread community risk. A significant study in 2020 identified Christian nationalism as a leading predictor that individuals would prioritize the economy and deprioritize the vulnerable.
Why? What's the logic there?
The decision was driven by an ideology that successfully blends a specific Christian identity, one tied to an aggressive conception of individual liberty and economic prosperity, with political ends. The idea is that individual effort, liberty, and success are somehow guaranteed or, favored by God.
So state intervention.
State intervention, particularly on behalf of the vulnerable, is seen as an infringement on that ordained freedom. The worldview dictates prioritizing economic continuity, even if it compromises communal safety.
That's a powerful mechanism to transform a generalized religious belief into a very specific policy stance on economics and public health, and it connects right back to our opening anecdote, the gentleman rejecting the Treaty of Tripoli. This ideological commitment seems powerful enough to actively reject objective historical facts if they don't fit the narrative.
This is perhaps the most dangerous sociological symptom of all, a profound and measurable cognitive dissonance regarding history. Researchers found that CNUS is the single strongest predictor that Americans fail to affirm factually correct answers about religion's place in American founding documents and history.
And they're not just unsure, are they?
No, that's the striking thing. Adherents often affirm confidently incorrect views. They don't just say, "I don't know." They express certainty in a historical falsehood.
Why does that happen?
It arises because allegiance to a particular political cultural narrative, the narrative they want to be true, the Christian nation narrative, is more important than the historical reality. If the facts clash with the desired political identity, the facts are dismissed.
As technicality.
As technicalities, just like the gentleman in your anecdote did. It shows a systemic vulnerability to misinformation, but only when that misinformation confirms one's deeply held political identity.
That sets the stage perfectly for our next segment. We saw the cognitive dissonance about U.S. history, but let's examine the actual historical mechanism, the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. How did the U.S. model of separation even originate? And what was its original intent, which seems so contrary to the narrative today?
Well, the U.S. model is unique, and it's rooted in this idea of religious liberty. The original purpose of the First Amendment's Establishment Clause was, frankly, radical. It was to disestablish religion.
Disestablish, not just separate.
Right, and this wasn't primarily intended to create a secular public culture. The goal was to liberate religious institutions from government support and, crucially, from government control.
So the founders, they had seen centuries of religious wars and state-sponsored persecution in Europe.
And they realized that intertwining church and state corrupted both.
So the separation was designed not to weaken religion, but to save it from the corrupting influence of politics.
Exactly. The core liberal argument was that establishing religion with exclusive privileges would actually weaken the spiritual vitality and diversity of the churches. The idea was that if religious expression was supported by pluralism and diversity, free from government interference, it would flourish on its own merit.
That's where Jefferson's famous phrase comes from.
The wall of separation between church and state, yes.
But looking at today, I mean, that wall seems pretty heavily breached. You've got "in God we trust" on currency, "under God" in the pledge. How did we get from that original rigorous disestablishment to what often looks more like an accommodationist model?
The shift largely occurred in the mid-20th century, and it was driven by the Cold War. Before the 1950s, the U.S. did not formally have "in God we trust" as its national motto.
And "under God" wasn't in the pledge.
It wasn't. Those were specific Cold War initiatives, legislative acts in 1956 and 1954, intended to symbolically position America's civil religion against what was termed atheistic communism.
So that accommodation, that history, created a much cozier relationship between faith and government.
It did, and it blurred the lines of neutrality that the founders intended, which in turn gives fuel to the political groups today who are demanding a return to these later accommodated traditions.
Okay, so if we use that U.S. model secularism as neutrality, but a neutrality that's constantly being challenged, we can look at some global alternatives to see how other democracies manage this fundamental conflict.
Exactly. Let's start with the extreme opposite end of the spectrum. Assertive secularism, which you see exemplified by France.
Right, Laïcité.
Laïcité. It's a system committed to an ideological secularism that actively works to exclude religion from public influence. Unlike the U.S., where the focus is on protecting religion from the state.
In France, it's the other way around.
It's about protecting the republic and its universal secular ideals of citizenship for the divisive potential of religion.
So what does that look like in practice? Beyond the famous bans on religious clothing, what's the philosophical driver?
The driver is the French Republican ideal, which aims for uniformity and universality in the public sphere. The idea is, when a citizen enters the public realm, they're supposed to shed their particular religious or cultural identity to participate equally as a universal French citizen.
Which is a sharp contrast to the U.S. model, which emphasizes pluralism and protects individual expressions of difference.
A very sharp contrast. And this commitment to laïcité has led to some pretty militant measures. You have the 2004 law banning religious symbols, including the Islamic headscarf in public schools. And then later, the 2010 ban on full-face veils in all public places.
And these laws have been challenged, I assume?
Constantly. But they're frequently upheld, even in the European Court of Human Rights, on the grounds that upholding the principle of secularism is necessary to protect the democratic system, even if it restricts individual religious expression.
That just seems like such a direct conflict between individual religious autonomy and the state's desire for a uniform civil identity.
It is a direct conflict. There's the case of a student named Dogru in a French school. She challenged the school's requirement to wear standardized sports clothes in PE, arguing it violated her religious freedom.
Because she couldn't cover her body adequately.
Right. And the legal consensus supported the school. It prioritized the school's ability to maintain a clear secular environment, a kind of public order, over the individual student's interpretation of religious manifestation. It shows the fundamental difference. The French state places a higher premium on uniformity in the public sphere. Turkey, for decades, followed a very similar strict path, though recent constitutional battles there have shown just how unstable that aggressive approach can be.
Okay, so let's move to the middle ground. How does a country like Germany achieve some kind of balance? They're clearly not strictly separate like the U.S. founders intended, but they're not aggressively exclusionary like France.
Germany represents a managed, what you could call tolerant establishmentarianism. The state doesn't endorse one faith, but it cooperates very closely with designated major religious groups, specifically the Evangelical Church, the Catholic Church, and the Jewish communities, by granting them public corporation status.
What does public corporation status actually mean on the ground? How does the state fund religion without violating neutrality?
Well, this status grants them state support, which is primarily collected through the German church tax, the Kirchensteuer.
That's fascinating.
It really is. It's a government-collected tax that's applied to registered members of these specific religious bodies. The government collects the tax, which is typically 8 to 9% of the individual's income tax liability, and then it distributes that revenue back to the religious organizations.
And the state's involvement doesn't stop there, right?
Not at all. These religious corporations use this significant revenue to fund kindergartens, schools, hospitals, massive social service networks. They pay the salaries of clergy. And on top of that, the state constitutionally mandates religious instruction in public schools.
And the curriculum is defined by the churches.
The curriculum content is defined by the churches themselves, though students can opt out. So this model, it dilutes absolute separation, but it incorporates religion into the public administration structure in a managed, cooperative way. It leverages faith organizations for massive social benefit.
That's a fundamentally different approach, using state resources to support religious social infrastructure. Okay, now let's look at a scenario where the constitutional framework has to rely on ambiguity, just to manage intense, pre-existing internal religious conflict. Let's talk about Israel.
Israel is the perfect example of permissive constitutionalism in a deeply divided society. The state is defined by this inherent equivocal tension. It is both Jewish and democratic.
And crucially, it doesn't have a single formal written constitution.
No, it relies on a series of basic laws instead. And this intentional ambiguity allows the political system the flexibility to manage the profound ideological rift between the secular and the religious visions of the state.
So how does the state operationalize that ambiguity to keep social order from collapsing under its own internal contradictions?
They preserve and utilize the Ottoman-era Millet system. This system, which was inherited from earlier imperial rules, guarantees pluralist religious rights by financing and giving exclusive jurisdiction to religious courts, Jewish, Muslim, and Druze over personal status matters.
Primarily family law.
Primarily family law, marriage, divorce, inheritance.
Wait, so the state is financially supporting religious courts that then enforce specific religious codes. What are the practical implications of that? Granting religious courts jurisdiction over something as fundamental as marriage.
It creates what you'd call a non-liberal, pluralist legal system. On one hand, it ostensibly accommodates minority groups by granting them autonomy in the sphere of personal status. But critics argue the system inherently acts as a natural barrier to intermarriage.
Which strategically preserves Jewish identity.
Correct. The state effectively delegates the maintenance of religious boundaries to these separate courts. And by doing so, it avoids having to impose a strict secular ideal, which would absolutely alienate the large religious population.
Can you give an example of that?
The halakhic marriage and divorce laws applied by the rabbinical courts are a perfect illustration. They often restrict the freedom to exit a marriage, especially for women who could become agano chain women, unable to get a religious divorce without their husband's consent.
And it restricts who can even get married in the first place.
It does. Interfaith civil marriages are not recognized if they're conducted within Israel's borders. So by funding and empowering these religious legal systems, this permissive constitutionalism maintains the status quo of division and identity preservation through state-supported law.
These constitutional comparisons are so crucial because they show states actively designing systems, whether they're aggressive, cooperative, or ambiguous, to manage religious difference and maintain civil order. But now we turn to the Punjab case study, where the concern wasn't about constitutional design, but about political leaders deliberately creating and exploiting a religious identity for short-term electoral gain.
and that led to the collapse of order.
What was the historical trajectory of Sikh ethno-nationalism?
Well, the narrative of Sikhism post-independence is really defined by the belief, which is rooted in the Khalsa tradition, that religion and politics are inseparable. You have Miri, or temporal authority, and Piri, spiritual authority, coexisting. Political sovereignty is often viewed as necessary to defend the faith.
And then came the partition of India in 1947.
Which was devastating. And after the massive population shifts that followed, Punjab was eventually reorganized in 1966. This reorganization, known as the Punjabi Suba movement, made Punjab the only state in India with a Sikh majority.
But the movement itself immediately got tangled up with religious identity.
Immediately.
How did language politics become religious politics?
It was subtle, but it was defining. The Akali Dal, which is the religion-based party representing Sikh interest, championed the use of the Gurmukhi script for the Punjabi language.
Okay.
But many Punjabi Hindus, who feared Sikh hegemony and the potential for increased Sikh political dominance, intentionally registered Hindi as their mother tongue in the census. They effectively disavowed Punjabi.
Wow. That's a huge political statement.
It was a single, collective political gesture that injected the virus of communalism permanently into Punjab politics. It hardened the identity lines, and it strengthened the Akali Dal's claim as the sole representative of the Sikh community, the Khalsa Panth.
So language becomes the first axis of difference, and the Akali Dal seizes on this to create powerful political currency. How did they then translate those regional grievances into a full-blown ethno-nationalist platform?
After facing some electoral defeats in the early 1970s, the Shiromani Akali Dal, or SED, they needed a major platform to mobilize their base. So in 1973, they adopted the Anandpur Sahib Resolution, the ASR.
And on the surface, this resolution was just demanding more state autonomy, right?
On the surface, yes. It demanded maximum state autonomy, reserving only things like defense, currency, and foreign relations for the central government. It was a federalist demand, not that different from what other states were seeking.
But it was polarizing. Why?
Because the Akali Dal issued two distinct versions. The public English version emphasized federalism and minority rights, but the unpublished Punjabi version described Sikhs explicitly as a nation. A nation seeking a predominant role in state administration. And that distinction, it transformed what could have been a standard political negotiation into an exclusive communal issue. It gave the SAD a powerful religion-based tool for mobilizing the Sikh electorate, while at the same time raising massive alarm bells in Delhi about potential secession.
This sounds like a tense but, still manageable political environment. How did the ruling Congress Party then actively and, cynically destabilize the entire region for their own short-term gain?
This is the really chilling part of political expediency. The ruling Congress Party, led from Delhi, pursued what researchers have termed an unprincipled electoral policy. Their goal was simple: destroy the moderate Akali Dal politically at any cost.
They saw the tension not as a crisis to solve, but as an opportunity to exploit.
Exactly, and this is the moment they actively introduced the extremist Sant Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale.
They created him, in a political sense?
They projected him. He was a powerful religious preacher, the head of the Damdami Taksal, but Congress intended to use him to divide the Sikh vote. They thought a hardline religious figure would splinter the Panthic vote and undermine the established moderate Akali leaders.
And they helped him.
They provided him with logistical support. They were engaging in pure, cynical communal politics while, claiming to be the standard bearers of secularism.
But their pawn very quickly became an existential threat. What was the source of his unexpected explosive strength, especially among the youth?
Bhindranwale successfully channeled profound, tangible socioeconomic grievances into a religious movement. The Green Revolution had brought prosperity to Punjab generally, but the benefits were lopsided.
Leaving many people feeling left behind.
Exactly. Many educated Jat Sikh youth from disadvantaged districts like Amritsar and Gurdaspur felt marginalized and alienated from the political process. Bhindranwale provided both a structure and an enemy for them.
And there was a key turning point, wasn't there?
The 1978 Nirankari Sikh clash, where 13 Akhand Kirtani Jata Sikhs were killed. The state mishandled the subsequent investigation so badly that no one was found guilty of the murders.
Cementing the feeling that the state wouldn't protect them.
Precisely. And Bhindranwale used this failure of justice to consolidate his power. He channeled all that economic and political discontent into a singular religious focus: the defense of the faith against the fear of Hindu assimilation.
So his message wasn't just about theological purification. It was an explanation for systemic, political, and economic failure.
That's it, exactly. He became the main champion of Sikh reasonances by stressing the distinctiveness of Sikhism from Hinduism, urging Sikhs to arm themselves to protect their faith. Congress initially saw his rise as a convenient tool to split the opposition. They tragically failed to foresee that his influence would soon hijack the entire Sikh movement, transforming a regional political struggle into a militant ethno-religious confrontation.
And as the central government was busy manipulating Bindunmal, they continued to neglect genuine non-religious issues, which just further fueled the emotional alienation.
That neglect was critical.
Yeah.
The crisis intensified dramatically because the central government consistently mishandled non-religious but emotionally explosive issues. The division of river waters, a huge economic concern for an agricultural state.
And the status of Chandigarh.
And the unresolved status of Chandigarh as a shared capital. These remained festering wounds. And the Akalis constantly twisted these genuine economic and constitutional issues to illustrate blatant discrimination against Sikhs by Delhi. These failures became emotional touchstones, fueling this sense of persecution.
And then political indifference translated into active, undeniable, state-sponsored humiliation for the entire community. This seems to be the psychological tipping point.
It was. The turning point occurred during the 1982 Asian Games in New Delhi. Every single Sikh traveling through the state of Haryana to get to the Games, and I mean everyone, including VIPs, political leaders, members of parliament, was subjected to humiliating treatment by the police. They were stopped, they were searched aggressively at the sealed border.
That is an unprecedented act of collective suspicion.
It was an act that made Sikhs feel like suspects just because they were Sikhs. This was the moment that the prior relationship of inclusive others, where cultural and religious differences were accommodated, it just fundamentally broke down.
It convinced them that the majority saw them as an enemy.
It convinced many Sikhs that Hindus constituted an exclusive other, an oppressive majority that viewed them all with suspicion, and this profound sense of alienation, driven by competitive ethnic outbidding from rival political factions and met with repression by the state, including widespread extrajudicial encounters where many Sikh youngsters were killed.
It all led directly to the military assault on the Golden Temple.
Operation Blue Star in 1984.
The attack on the Golden Temple, the central symbol of the Sikh faith, was clearly meant to be decisive. But its political and psychological impact seems to have been convulsive and irreversible.
There was no parallel. It was more than a military operation. It was perceived as an attack on the Sikh psyche itself. The convulsive, lasting impact accelerated the feeling of slavery and alienation, and it definitively streamlined the narrative of the Sikh militants. That this had happened to them because they were Sikhs. The political manipulation had created the very enemy it was now fighting. The psychological damage was done.
So we've analyzed this on 3 levels. We have the U.S. case, which shows this ideological commitment that's bolstered by a rejection of facts. We have the constitutional systems, highlighting just how difficult it is to maintain those boundaries. And then we have the Punjab case, which shows the calculated creation of a militant identity for short-term political gain.
And the comparison forces us to look past the ideology and focus on the core political mechanism: manipulation. The data from local communities in Punjab after the crisis, it confirms this analysis. When people were surveyed, 100% of respondents agreed that religion and politics go side by side during elections. They understood that faith was political currency.
But they also believed that separation was possible, which suggests they didn't see the violence as inevitable.
Exactly. 78.57% of respondents believed that separation was possible through appropriate actions. This is key. It demonstrates a deep public awareness that the political elites were the primary culprits.
They used the enmity.
They used internal enmity and exploited genuine minority grievances for purely selfish short-term electoral ends. They maximized the conflict while the common man suffered the bloodshed.
And there was anecdotal evidence for this too.
Strong anecdotal evidence. Some local respondents recalled that even Mindranwal was telling Hindus and Sikhs to remain firm in their own religions, suggesting that the wrong discussions, the opportunistic political rhetoric, the electoral strategies, the failure of successive governments, were far more damaging than any theological rift.
Others just blamed the government agencies directly.
They did. They noted that political enmity spoiled religion and prosperity in the state, even if social relations at a personal level had remained unaffected for a time.
The profound tragedy here is the realization that the turmoil was not some unavoidable clash of civilizations. It was an engineered crisis. And the struggle in Punjab shows how a political separatist movement fueled by ethnic rhetoric, it just quickly degenerated into pure and simple criminal terrorism.
And this is where political expediency reaches its most chilling extreme. It shows the complete moral collapse of the state. In a devastating tactic, the police, as part of their counterinsurgency measures, began seizing militant letterpads.
Their official letterheads.
They then used these to commit common crimes like robbery and rape.
So they were framing the militants.
They were intentionally defaming the organizations, creating chaos within the ranks, and manufacturing justification for further repression.
Wait, so the state was actively creating the very chaos and terror it claimed to be fighting just to acquire legitimacy and maintain power?
Precisely. They were weaponizing the identity they had helped to radicalize. Whether the strategy is subtle, like the misinformation campaigns used in the U.S. to confirm confident but incorrect historical narratives, or brutal, like the state-sponsored crime committed under the guise of militant action in Punjab, the mechanism is the same.
Weaponizing religious identity.
It justifies exclusion, it fuels polarization, and it inevitably leads to profound suffering and the systematic erosion of trust in every single institution, in history, in science, in the police.
We've seen that the collision of faith and political ambition is a global pattern. It happens through constitutional wrangling in Israel or through calculated violent exploitation in India. The U.S., with its foundational commitment to separation, is constantly being challenged by the allure of this ethno-nationalist identity politics.
The constitutional frameworks, whether they pursue separation, neutrality, or assertive secularism, they're all just attempts to create civil order in pluralistic societies. But they are all inherently vulnerable. Vulnerable to political leadership that prioritizes short-term electoral gain over the rule of law.
And when religious identity is strategically politicized,
as was the case with the Congress Party's promotion of Bindranwale, the subsequent loss of life and prosperity for the entire community is a direct, measurable consequence. The common people themselves recognized it. They said their state went back decades and their youth were completely derailed, all because of the narrow and selfish purposes of the leaders they had trusted.
The evidence from every context we examine, it really points toward a single conclusion that transcends geography and theology.
The greatest threat to a functional, pluralistic society is not the existence of diverse faiths. It is the cynical, opportunistic fusion of faith and political ambition, a calculated strategy used by political elites that inevitably leads to the erosion of truth, the collapse of institutions, and profound unnecessary human suffering.